I'm in hopes of being able to trace a single principle from the origins of our country to modern day, in hopes that it will prove to be, as the years go on, part of that consensus in law, which I think lies at the foundation of constitutional liberty and constitutional stability. I speak of freedom of religion, but my theme today is not going to be separation. Separation of church and state comes from a Jeffersonian phrase written by Jefferson as president to the Danbury Baptist Association. But many people have criticized that metaphor for its inadequacy, for its ambiguity. And I must say I share that view. If you take the word separation literally, it means that police and fire departments can't go protect churches, and that's not what anybody means. It must mean something other than what many people have tried to say. And I suggest to you the theme is equality. Our nation's earliest principles of religious liberty were principles of equality. They are the root of a maturing aspiration that deepened and broadened over time, that government must deny no person the equal protection of the laws. Now, I grant you, you're not going to find many people who draw a link between Jefferson's Religious Freedom Bill and the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And so it must seem a little unusual and perhaps all too academic to have someone defend that view today. But set aside for a moment all the rhetoric and partisan brouhaha about separation. Set aside even Clarence Thomas's criticism of Madison's, quote, more extreme, unquote, notions of separation, which he said are based upon things like social contracts, natural law, and equality. The key document, which I wish every American would read, is the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. Religious freedom derives from the principle that equality ought to be the basis of every law. Now, it's quite remarkable that a Virginia slaveholder would write that in an argument about religious freedom, but that's what James Madison did in 1785, 2 years before the Constitution, and a full decade before we really got around to figuring out what the Bill of Rights meant. He argued that a person's duty to God is precedent both in order of time and degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. And therefore, duties to God have a higher degree of importance than what civil society might command. Now, this is a quite radical idea in the life of law through Western civilization. It means that the religion of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. And that means, as Americans wrote then, of every human being, not just every man. He also believed in freedom of religion for non-believers, and that's a critical point. In his Memorial and Remonstrance, he makes the idea that you can't have religious freedom unless it is equally available to those whose minds have not been persuaded of the existence of God. Now, I suggest to you that these original principles, present before the creation of our constitutional republic in 1787, deepened by their inclusion in state constitutions, deepened by a wide variety of statutes which also said people should be equal despite their religious opinions, have more to teach us about contemporary problems than we ordinarily think. Now, Madison was supporting Jefferson's Bill for Religious Freedom. Some of you may know Jefferson was very proud of that. He was more proud of that than he was of being President of the United States. When he designs his own tombstone, he mentions the fact he's author of the Declaration of Independence. He mentions the fact that he founded the University of Virginia, and he mentions the fact that he wrote the Virginia Bill for Religious Freedom. And what does that say? It says essentially, the civil rights of every human being should not be increased nor decreased, neither enhanced nor abridged, because of their religious opinions or religious practices. Now, I want you to step back from that, forget separation, and recognize that is an early version of an anti-discrimination principle. And we're not going to talk about discrimination as such until well into the 19th century. But as written, it's a way of saying your status in the community, your ability to enter into contracts, hold property, and marry should not depend on whether you're going to church or not, or whether you believe in God or not. Now, there are a lot of practices in the colonial period where different religious communities took very different points of view. North Carolina said before you could hold property, you had to acknowledge God. Even in the middle of the 19th century, Texas revolted, at least in part, because you could not marry without becoming a Catholic. The year of that revolution, the progressive state of Arkansas adopted the Jeffersonian bill and the Jeffersonian language and the Madisonian theory in their 1836 state constitution. My point is this: we ought to rethink our issues in light of the idea that dignity, equality, should not depend upon a person's adherence or non-adherence to religious practices, religious forms, religious rituals. Now, once again, it is pretty hard to figure out what Jefferson and Madison are thinking. They were, after all, guilty of some of the most egregious violations of human equality. And they took their stands even in public places. But as often is true in American history, they tended to think separately from the way they acted. They tended to work through the problems of equality in their mind before they were able to bring that to bear on practical options before legislatures, presidents, and governors. And they're not the only ones guilty of that. Lincoln's guilty of it. Kennedy, Johnson. Everyone is guilty of having convictions of a philosophical character that are worked through in the privacy of a study and the ability to actually implement it in public policy. Now, a lot of people criticize looking at Jefferson and Madison in these debates. And I suppose they would criticize it if we're talking about equality, just like they criticize it when we talk about separation. And they have a point. Jefferson and Madison thought more about this, wrote more about this than the other subjects of civil liberties. They largely ignored the question of freedom of speech, for example. But I contend that their thinking about religious freedom was extensive, sophisticated, detailed, serious, and passionate. And they influenced their countrymen. Now, if you're looking for somebody to influence, if you are living in Virginia, one nice person to influence is George Washington. And George Washington contributes to the debate about religious freedom a couple of passages I want to read to you because I think they're important. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if by the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under the protection should demean themselves as good citizens, giving it on all occasions their effective support. Now, that's a very striking passage, and in many ways it's un-Washingtonian, who is not, like Jefferson and Madison, given to extensive discussions of this kind, but it is striking in its idealism, striking in its embracing of rights of citizenship as a basis for equality. These are principles that will emerge in the 19th century and become the foundation of Lincoln's contributions to the Republic. But Washington was writing before we had a First Amendment. And then, after we had a First Amendment, after it's ratified, he returns back to this theme in another message from the White House. Admittedly, it was not called the White House at the time. Message from the President's house. We have abundant reason to rejoice that in this land the light of truth and reason has triumphed over the power of bigotry and superstition, and that every person may here worship God according to the dictates of his own heart. He's been talking to Madison. In this enlightened age and in this land of equal liberty, it is our boast that a man's religious tenets will not forfeit his protection of the laws, nor deprive him of the right of attaining or holding the highest offices that are known in the United States. If you parse through that phrase, you're going to find a lot of the modern concepts of modern civil liberty related to religious freedom. I only wish he had used the phrase equal protection of the laws rather than the protection of the laws, but I suggest to you he meant the same thing. An ability of a human being to be protected in the ordinary governmental interest should not depend upon the distance between that individual and a church, and the distance between that individual's behavior and church teachings. Now, original thinking isn't enough. When we talk about original understandings, we usually like to link it to text. If Justice Scalia has taught us nothing, a conclusion which I'm occasionally tempted to reach, he's taught us text matters. Now, someone made reference to it this morning. Lincoln spent a good deal of his time before he became president arguing there's a link between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That too is an idealistic notion. And there was really no basis for it in the law until 1868, when we finally had the text which referred to the principle of equality as a constitutional matter. That, of course, is the 14th Amendment. And that amplified things that had been said in the state constitutions. What did they have in mind? I concede they didn't have in mind a lot of things we anticipate today. If the argument, that we've always thought of it this way, is enough to make a practice constitutionally reasonable and constitutionally sufficient, we'd still have slavery, we'd still have segregation, we'd still have laws against interracial marriage, we would still have a wide variety of intrusions on free speech, and we'd have established churches. But our constitutional development gradually took principles of a general nature and gave them a specificity that the Supreme Court could recognize and enforce. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was an inspiration for the Equal Protection Clause. And what it says is all persons, regardless of race, should have the same ability to make and enforce contracts, the same ability to enter into property arrangements, and the same ability to marry. Contrary to what the dissent implied in the marriage equality case of last June, when they tried to say there is no specific theory of marriage in the Constitution, narrowly phrased, they're right. Marriage is very definitely an element of rights associated with the pursuit of happiness and thought to be covered by the 14th Amendment. What's remarkable, despite the ambiguities, generalities, and frustrating open-ended qualities of I'm not going to bash him, I'm going to bash Anthony Kennedy. Kennedy's remarks are just very difficult to teach, partly because they're difficult to understand. But the dissenting opinions have the same quality. They make a number of remarkable claims which have little or no basis in existing constitutional doctrine, that are in fact inconsistent with existing constitutional doctrine. And let me be more specific about that. I would have preferred an opinion that made a couple of basic points, which I suggest are rooted in our general understandings of law and in our original aspirations. Point one, marriage is the right to make enforceable, life-sharing promises in the form of civil contracts, and it is protected by federal constitutional traditions. Now, we don't need to get into debate about whether it's more important or less important than other elements of an ability to pursue happiness. The point is, it's one of them. The second basic point is that public policy regulating marriage may exist, but that public policy must not be the sole function or the sole product of religious doctrine. Third, the prohibition on same-sex unions, as opponents of marriage equality demonstrate, is primarily, even exclusively, religious in character. This is a way in which religious doctrines are used to establish one level of citizenship rights for human beings and another for other human beings who are not following religious practices. They say it over and over again. They are trying to implement God's plan. That is something the churches may do. That is something the individuals may do. It is not something the state may do. Let me close with a quotation from one of the forgotten founders, Elder John Leland of the Baptist Church. We owe a lot of our freedoms to the Baptist Church. You'd never know it from the way politics works today. But John Leland met with James Madison on a country road in Virginia, which I had a chance to visit last summer. It's just nothing there except a little statue now. And he put his arms around James Madison and said, "James, if you don't support a Bill of Rights, we're not going to support you in your first race for Congress. We're going to support James Monroe, your neighbor." And Madison began the great American tradition of the flip-flop. He had opposed a Bill of Rights in the convention, but now he knew his duty, and he promised his ally, Leland, who had supported him in the opposition to religious assessments, to support a Bill of Rights. He introduces a Bill of Rights. And in the year the Bill of Rights is ratified, this is what Leland says about these issues. "What leads legislators into this error is confounding sins and crimes together, making no difference between moral evil and state rebellion, not considering that a man may be infected with moral evil and yet be guilty of no crime, punishable by law. If a man worships one God, 3 gods, 20 gods, or no God, if he pays adoration 1 day a week or 7 days or no days, wherein does he injure the life, liberty, or property of another? Let any or all of these actions be supposed to be religious evils of enormous size, yet they are not crimes to be punished by the laws of the state, which extend no further injustice than to punishment of the man who works ill to his neighbor." Now that is a very libertarian vision of the rights of human beings present at the creation of this republic, at the creation of the Bill of Rights, and I wish that we would reconsider and reconstruct our understanding of the principle of marriage equality to see it as an origin of that equality. Thank you very much.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.